Let's get joined up. This week's show is sponsored by Bandcamp.com, an online record store and music community where passionate fans discover, connect with, and directly support the artists they love. There's thousands of bands and artists on there, including my band, the Rye Dogs, whose second album, Pigs Might Fly, is out right now. Here's a quick snippet of the title track, which is also available on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple Music.
Your eyes may be weeping, but your conscience is sleeping. So baby, don't you cry.
It's totally free to join Bandcamp, and as the Rye Dogs are brand new members, we're now looking to grow our fan base, so your support would be greatly appreciated. Just search the Rye Dogs, that's W-R-Y Dogs, and hit the follow button. Right, now we can cue the theme tune. Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 185 with Claire McGlasson, author of new novel The Misadventures of Margaret Finch. We talk about creativity, using real life and history as jumping off points for fiction, and what agents are really looking for when they pick up our manuscripts. Speaking of which, a very quick catch up from me this week as I'm flat out working through the mentor notes on my novel. I've been getting up early and working at night, incorporating lots of Lauren's brilliant ideas and adding more layers of emotion to the story, whilst hopefully anyway making sure I keep momentum and pace throughout the book. It's been hard work and yet incredibly fun, to be honest, to develop the book and to find new stuff I didn't even know was there. I honestly didn't think I'd be adding more words at this stage, more new words anyway, but I've added a few new chapters that really seem to bring out the themes of the novel, but more importantly, raise the stakes and give it more emotional impact. At least, as I say, I hope so. And it'll then be a case of going back for yet another pass and trimming back anything that doesn't push the story along or illuminate something about one or more of the characters. And then the next wave of submissions / rejections. No, let's be positive. Just submissions will begin and I'll keep you posted. So that's me, but what about you? How are things in your writing worlds? Let me know and get in touch by tweeting me at JU Podcast, emailing wayne@waynekellywrites.com or dropping me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join one or both of the email mailing lists at joinedupwriting.co.uk or waynekellywrites.com. They're totally free and you get a couple of downloadable goodies when you sign up, and you'll be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, enough about me. Let's get to today's interview with Claire McGlasson. Claire grew up in Biggleswade in Bedfordshire with no idea that she lived just a few miles away from a secretive cult of women, or that their story would inspire her to one day write a novel. In addition to her career in TV journalism, she now teaches creative writing at the Institute of Continuing Education at the University of Cambridge, and she offers private mentoring and editing services to emerging writers. Her new book, The Misadventures of Margaret Finch, is out right now, so enjoy the chat and I'll pop back at the end to wrap things up. Okay, Claire, thanks a million for joining me on Joined Up Writing. Really appreciate it. So, first of all, why don't you give us a sense of how things are going and tell us where you're speaking from?
I am speaking from my home in Cambridgeshire, and I appreciate you having me on. At home in Cambridgeshire, I didn't know if that was going to be a question about where are we at in terms of writing, which is a much more difficult one. I would sidestep.
That's I was going to say that's more difficult than actually saying where you're located. That's probably easier.
Yeah. So at home, I'm lucky enough to have a writing room in the bottom of the garden. I call it the plotting shed.
Nice, very nice.
And I'm lucky enough to be able to escape down there to get some work done, but I'm staying indoors today.
Yeah, it's freezing. It is here anyway. I don't know whether it is where you are.
Yeah.
It's not been very nice today, but that's the British getting the weather chat
yes,
out of the way.
being very polite.
So why don't you start off by telling me about your new book, The Misadventures of Margaret Finch?
It's a book set in Blackpool in the 1930s, the late 1930s, and it brings together something that I think is probably becoming my niche, although I'm only two novels in, which is that it's inspired um, very heavily by real life. So
Uh-huh.
my first book, The Rapture, was about a real life cult of women in the 1920s. And this one is about two real stories that I've imagined have collided. So the first is the Mass Observation Project. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No.
A sociological project in the 1930s, where essentially the headline is that posh folk from London, well-meaning sort of liberal types, went undercover in Blackpool as working class folk to spy on the how the other half lived, and
Yeah.
would make lots of records of what's the average time it takes to drink a pint, and how many women would forego the wearing of stockings on a hot day on the beach. Just collected all this data. So Margaret Finch is an imagined researcher who's gone undercover, and she crosses paths with a real figure from history who was the Harold Davidson, the rector of Stiffkey. And I'm reluctant to say too much more because I know that people will Google him and completely give away
Yeah, don't do that.
the
You want don't
crux of the
spoil
book.
the story, so don't Google it,
Don't
people.
Google. Do not
It's like
Google.
what my wife does whenever we watch a program, a film or something, or anything that's based on real life. I always say, no, no, no. She always starts Googling the real thing. I'm like,
Yeah,
no, let's just watch it. Let's just,
yeah.
don't no spoilers.
It is a bit of a worry of mine because if you're not making everything up, I sometimes think I shouldn't be doing this based on real life thing. I just find that fact really is, stranger than fiction, and I think at times I think people are going to just think, well, this would never happen, and then you remind yourself as a writer that it really did. So,
Yeah.
but he was a Church of England vicar defrocked for accusations of improper conduct with prostitutes in London. So he led a very high profile case to clear his name and went to Blackpool to exhibit himself in the weird and wonderful sideshows there, and was really the most famous man in England for a while. He was keeping Hitler off the front pages. So,
Wow.
a household name, and put himself on display where you could pay a shilling to see the man himself. So Margaret crosses paths with him, and that's was really my starting point for the novel.
That's great. It was, as you say, really, really interesting story, and the way that you can kind of combine the fact and the fiction, or at least use it as the springboard. So I was going to say, was there a specific reason Blackpool? But obviously, from what you've said there, that's because of what the real life side of things. So where did you kind of draw all your inspiration in creating Margaret Finch, or was that, how did she come about in your mind?
She came about as someone who sees the world, or tries to see the world in very black and white terms, who looks for she's looking for data and answers and certainty in a very uncertain world, particularly as the novel set in 1938, which, as we know, is just on the eve of the outbreak of the Second
Hmm.
World War. But she's someone who thinks that there is a right and wrong to everything, and
Hmm.
crossing paths with a man who was such a controversial figure, and really divided opinion whether he was saint or sinner,
Uh-huh.
causes her to question. And she's really a character who spends her life watching other people, watching them and sort of interrogating how they live their lives. And I love the idea in the novel that she, through her experiences, comes to sort of live her own rather than watching other people, which is not
Yeah.
an easy thing for her. I'm very fond of Margaret. She's quite an unusual character. I think might be quite difficult to get along with in real life. Um, but I'm just so fond of her after spending so many months in her company in my little writing room in the garden.
Yeah, well, that's great. So you mentioned there your debut, The Rapture, that was set in the 20s, and obviously this is set in the 30s, admittedly the late 30s.
Yes.
What do you think kind of draws you back to that particular period in history, those sort of 2 decades?
I think those interwar years are really, really fascinating because you've come off the back of such unimaginable loss. I mean, in the Rapture, these women who, to all intents and purposes, have been the punchline of a joke, or and could still be so. They believed their daughter was their leader was the daughter of God. They
Hmm.
were a very polite group of women. who would sort of lay out a place for Jesus at their garden parties that they held, um, very concerned with the proper way that things should be done. Um, and all lived together, this group of women trying to persuade people that their leader was the daughter of God. But I think when you see them in the context of that, the suffering that the country had gone through, the number of men they'd lost, I started to think about, why would you join a cult?
Hmm.
And the thing about cults is that you never realize you're in, you wouldn't use that word when you're in it.
No, that's
But
right. It's a club.
they believed that their leader wouldn't die. She died. They then rewrote their sort of manifesto to keep making allowances for things changing.
Yeah.
But a lot of them were former suffragists. A lot of them, you know, had lost so much, and they couldn't understand um, how the church could be telling them that there was this, this God that loved them, and they came to believe that, although Christ would save their souls, they were saying, well, what about the suffering here and now? And to make sense of that, they sort of came up with this ideology which would explain the suffering and give them a way out of it. Men had made rather a mess of things, and it was up to women to
Yeah.
sort of put things right on earth. Um, and that interwar period comes off the back of the war to end all wars, and then
Hmm.
is gearing up to this time that nobody really wants to believe
Hmm.
that conflict is going to happen again. And there's that sort of turning away from the reality. The fact that a rural rector who was involved in a scandal was keeping Hitler off the front page says something about where
Yeah.
people wanted to turn their
Yeah.
attention,
Yeah.
to be looking at the smaller things.
Yeah.
And we tend to look at World War One, World War Two, but I think that period in between, it really fascinates me. So much happens in that time.
Yeah, and as you say, with the benefit of hindsight, what one's intrinsically linked to the other
Mm,
one. The stuff that happens, obviously, the aftermath of the First World War is what directly led to the Second World War, and all the stuff that's in between. And obviously, there's things that you can link back with today as regards being interested in anything that's kind of trivial and sideshowy, if you like, rather than looking at what's really going on in the world and all the problems that we've got.
yeah, I think historical fiction sort of holds up a mirror to the present, and I
Mm,
always enjoy it most when it chimes with now. And I think most things do, no matter how far you go back, because people essentially, at their core have the same emotions.
yeah.
But I was aware writing this that things that we think we've left in the past, the real class divide,
Mm.
are really not
No,
that far
not
away.
at all.
And
No.
things that we think are modern phenomena like celebrity culture and people wanting fame at all costs was going on then with a rural rector from Norfolk. This idea of wanting to be seen and wanting to be famous, and the cost that can have. We're really not that different from where we were 100 years ago.
No, absolutely. Completely agree. So, how do you kind of approach the research for something like this? Do you tend to do lots of reading and kind of submerge yourself in it before you even start actually writing the novel, or do you want to get yourself in the right headspace, or do you just crack on with the story and then research as you go?
I tend to do a lot of research, and when you say about submerging, that is how I think of the process, really. It's like a deep dive into a lake. And I
Yeah.
kind of clutch at things. I do take lots of notes, but then I put those notebooks away. And it's a bit like the shiny things that catch my eye underwater. I'll kind of grab them. And then I come back up to the surface and see what I've got. And I
Yeah.
think it's the things that um, really speak to me that tend to then inspire the story, because I think you can get really bogged down with research. At that point, I mean, for instance, mass observation, my discovery of that, which I'd never heard of, came about through researching Blackpool in the late 1930s, because I was aware of the rector of Stiffkey. So I couldn't kind of write that book. I knew that I was interested in his story, and more recently, with Me Too, it's become even more relevant, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I couldn't find my way into his story, and I didn't really want to write a book about him. And then when I discovered mass observation through research at the period, it just clicked for me. So I tend to do a lot of research, then I step away from it, and then I allow myself little research trips or forays into books as a treat because I love the research and I would quite easily just disappear
Yeah.
into an archive forever. And then when it comes to things like, what people were wearing or, I try to write without thinking too much about those things. And then I'll come back and add some of that authentic flavor to it because I think it can get lost down a Google rabbit hole of, um, when were salt and shake crisps invented, which is what I did disappear down. Um, or you write something in and then you come back in the edit, don't you, and think, oh, well, that's not going to work now.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but yeah,
yeah.
procrastination is all too easy. So I tend to just make a little note to myself. Um,
That is always my thing with research. That is, and I'm exactly the same. I mean, I don't specifically write period things, but I even when I come across something, I get to a certain point in the story. What I do now is I just make a little square brackets, and I'll literally just put in capital letters, need name of gun here or name
yes.
of song here or whatever, because I've done it so many times. I think, okay, I'll just have a quick Google, I'll just have a quick look, and then I'll carry on writing. And then an hour and a half later, I'm watching some video on YouTube, and I'm like, hang
Yeah.
on a minute, I'm supposed to be writing.
And bought
So
10 books that you didn't
yeah,
really need.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. You know me so well. Yeah. So I totally relate to that. And then sort of take for example with the new book. At what point do you think, right, okay, now I know I'm ready to sit down and start actually writing this book? Does it just feel right? And at that point, do you then just try, I think I'll write a chapter to get the feel of it and get a sense of it, or are you one of these people is you need to know exactly where everything goes and you're going to plan everything to the nth degree before you even start?
I am a planner.
Hmm.
Um, Although, and a lot of writers say this, don't they? It doesn't always. I kind of know I will plan it in some detail and then I might take little diversions, those magic moments where, and I spend a lot of time thinking about it before I start. And I tell myself, this is work. I'm not putting it off. It's all part of the
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
Um, but then sometimes when you're writing and your characters will start to do things, it's almost like you reach a different level of writing. You're so in the moment that then
Mhm.
things start to happen. And I think for me, having a plan, I think it's left side and right side of brain, and I can't remember which is which, but it's a bit like that conversation that, writing is
Yeah.
different from editing. For me, if I've got a plan there, it somehow frees me to be much more um, responsive, I suppose, as I go along. And also it allows me to be much more playful, I think, on a sort of word and sentence level,
Hmm.
which is what I love most about writing. So I think it is a different part of my brain, or certainly a different feeling. I'm not thinking, oh, what's going to happen next, and having to use that sort of big picture stuff. I'm
Yeah.
really thinking about the sensory experience of that character, or which order the words go in there, or how can I just tweak that sentence to change the rhythm of it.
Hmm.
And that's the bit that I enjoy when I've got to that stage, really. It can take quite a lot of guessing there. But yeah, I think the irony is being a planner makes me more flexible.
No, I understand that. I mean, I'm kind of I do swing between the two things. I find that I have to get myself going. So I can't I struggle to literally just plan something right from the beginning and having not written anything. So I usually have to find that I have to write either at least one chapter, but sometimes a few chapters to get the voice and
Yeah,
realize who I'm actually whose story it is and who I'm telling the story and whether I'm actually interested and excited enough about it.
yeah,
And I think there comes a point where I do have to really think about it, and it's something I struggle with, but it does definitely improve for me. It improves the story because I can relate to what you're saying about it's in the back of my mind all the time is that little worry that am I just writing myself into oblivion here? Where am I actually
yeah.
going? Roughly speaking, where am I going? Okay, this particular chapter might feel fun, or I'm having fun writing about this specific thing, but what am I actually doing? What is the purpose of
Mm,
this scene? And because I write scripts and things as well, I mean, with script writing, the irony there is it is a saying that screenwriting is structure.
yeah,
You kind of every single scene, more than in a novel even, has to be doing something, whether it's an A to B or whether there's a change in the character or it's setting something up that literally, you can't justify anything being in there just for the hell of it. And so that's always in the back of my mind. I think now when I'm writing a novel, is hang on, yeah, this is like moderately entertaining, this scene, but why is it in the book? And
Is
obviously
this the
you could,
darling I got to kill?
yeah, exactly, yeah. Am I going to regret this later anyway? So I sort of understand that. So obviously this, as you say, this is the second book. So how did you find the experience of writing the second book? Was it different to writing your debut? Did you have that difficult second album syndrome? Did you feel the pressure following up your debut?
I think it took me a while to come to it because I wanted to find something. I think once you've written one, you know how hard it is and
Yeah.
how much it will take over your head and how many hours are involved. So I think it's a bit like climbing a mountain. I wanted to enjoy being at the top for a while and then really I wanted to have enough passion for something. And as I said, I knew that there was an idea there, but I couldn't quite find my way into it. And I didn't want to write something for the sake of it. And then lockdown happened, and I just really enjoyed hanging out in 1930s Blackpool, and having a sense of purpose. I was homeschooling my children at the time as well, but I found that I got into this rhythm of getting up early, and that became my space.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that probably made the experience more intense, but also just meant I got on with it. There were fewer distractions. And by that point, I'd fallen hard for this sort of character in this place and this story. So I think when I get to that stage, it's fine. And when we talk about the planning or going with the flow, I mean, I know writers, I'm sure you've interviewed many who don't like to know what happens because they're not
Uh-huh.
interested in turning up for work at their
Yeah,
desk.
that's right. Yeah.
And I suspect that it probably takes about the same amount of time, whether you're
Oh, I
sort of
agree.
front
Yeah.
loading it with all
Yeah.
that thought and
Yeah.
research and really
Yeah.
getting, and then I think I probably write a book that isn't wildly different from the first draft.
Hmm.
I mean, it's still pretty different and needs a lot of
Yeah.
finessing, but or some people will write the first draft almost as a thinking out loud or thinking onto the page,
That's right. Yeah.
and then go to the edit stage.
Mm.
So I think it's probably swings and roundabouts, isn't it?
I do. Yeah. I genuinely, I think it's like all of these things. I think there is no right and wrong way. There's only the way that works for you, whatever that looks like.
Mm,
And I think people, brand new writers or people that come into it completely new and thinking, okay, I'm going to take up writing as a hobby and I'm going to try and write a book or whatever. They are kind of, and I totally understand it because I can remember when I was much younger and so probably thinking about it in a similar way, but they almost think that there's some kind of formula, not necessarily to writing the story, but in terms of like getting the book written, they're like, oh, there's a really set way that I have to do this, or
yeah.
there's a right and wrong. And as far as I mean, I've probably like you, I mean, I've read dozens and dozens of writing books. I've watched loads of writing documentaries and interviews with writers, and obviously I've interviewed hundreds of writers for the podcast and stuff. But everybody's got their own way of doing it and their own way of thinking and their own way of coming to it. And some people it literally takes years from the beginning coming up with an idea to actually having something finished. Some people bash something out in a
Yeah.
few months. So but in terms of the actual, like you say, there's no getting around it. Whether you think through doing the writing or you think before and then start writing, you still the part that's consistent is the thinking. You
Yeah.
still have to do it. It's hard.
Yeah, and I think with the first one, I very much thought, I mean, I wrote The Rapture because I desperately wanted to read a book about this cult and no one else
Yeah,
was writing it.
yeah,
And I thought, this is a great hobby. It doesn't cost me very much. Some electricity to plug in my laptop and some then
yeah.
I went on to spend lots of money on books, but but
That's another story.
um
Yeah,
and um and so with the first one I knew I wanted to get published if I could, but it was more that I was writing the story that I wanted to read and just to see if I could do it because I'm a journalist by day
Mm,
And much like your screenwriting, I think, it is it's a different discipline.
mm,
Um, it's about brevity and tight deadlines and making, things being as straightforward and as spare as they can be. And then the thought of 90,000 words, it just it felt like a big challenge.
yeah,
Um, Not least because you can make stuff up, which you can't do as a journalist. So that was sort of liberating and terrifying at the same time. But with the second book, I'd already entered into the world of publishing, I suppose. So it does feel slightly different. It feels more like part of my or one of my jobs now. It feels like
yeah. I was
I
going to
am a
say that.
writer,
Yeah,
whereas before it was more a case of I I think that our goalposts keep moving, which can be a route to feeling dissatisfied all the time. But at first you think, I just want to finish this book and know that
yeah.
I can do it. And then you just want someone else to read it and like it. And then you just want to
That's right.
um find an agent and then you just want to get it. And then if you're
Yeah,
not careful, you're never satisfied. And I'm
that's
always
right.
really on guard for that because if you think back to what your first dream of this was, if you're not careful, you can get quite anxious, I think, and compared to other people. And I just think that the only thing that matters is the work. The rest of it, there's
Yeah,
so much luck and um market forces and all these other things, but I try and just bring it back to the work and am I proud of the book because that's not something that's subject to anything else, I suppose, my feelings about the work.
I
Um
totally agree. Yeah, I think the comparisonitis thing it affects all of us. I think especially in the age of social media and things. I mean, I think to my experience anyway, the writing not industry, but the writing world, if you like, in publishing and natural writers, really, really supportive in the
yes,
main. Most people they recognize the fact that if somebody buys your book, that doesn't mean they're not going to buy my book or whatever, or vice versa.
absolutely.
And so they're all really, really supportive. But as well as that, you still can't help. Sometimes you look at something and you think, "Oh, why has that person got that and I haven't got that?" Or, why? I've seen it where I've got friends that are, published authors, and they'll be like, "Why is that book massive? Why is that book absolutely
Yeah.
massive? Mine's kind of passing by, kind of unnoticed almost, or why is it getting more money spent on it, or whatever it is? There's always something." But like you say, you kind of forget. You quickly forget. I think once you've kind of reached whatever that first milestone that you've set yourself. Um, it does keep moving.
Yeah, my editor at Faber, Louisa Joyner, who's an absolute legend, and I'm very fortunate to work with her. We did an event at a literary festival. I'm sure it was her that said that publishers are there really um to whittle to whittle down.
Yeah,
There are so many books in the world, many of them never make it onto the shelves, and
yeah,
they're kind of curating the
yeah,
things that they think that we will like as readers. And my agent, Laura Williams, told me that agents are looking for a book that really speaks to them, and they might turn down, well, they do turn down hundreds of other books, but she said it's a bit like going into a bookshop. I could go into a bookshop tomorrow and I'm only going to be able to pick one book because that's what I can afford on that day. It doesn't mean that every other book on the shelf isn't great. It just
yeah,
means that I can only buy that one because I've
yeah,
only got so many hours to read and I've only got so many pounds to
yeah,
spend.
yeah,
And so I think that the market's just sort of it's narrowing things down, but not every book can be a smash hit or a bestseller.
no,
Um, and not every book speaks to anyone. And I think if we can connect with some readers who really, really feel, and this sounds a bit kind of lofty, really, but I think when we read a book and it changes us in some small way,
mm,
or has an impact on us, or leaves a lasting impression, that's that kind of contact with the wider world, which I think is really something.
mm-hmm,
Um, so I try and remind myself of that really, that the rest of it is a business. And I think once you've written a book and it's gone into, you sort of see the how it becomes packaged and sent out into the world, and then it becomes a commodity, really. But to me, it's still a piece of creative work that I'm proud of. It sort of it's like sending a child into the world, isn't it? And you kind of have to
That's right. Yeah.
cut the apron strings at that point. And
You
it's
give
then
them
a
the best shot, but
give
at
them
the
the
end of
best
the
shot,
yeah,
and
they've
then
got to
it's a
stand on their
sense
own two
of,
feet.
I put something on Twitter actually talking about how it takes a village to raise a book. You kind
Yeah,
of
yeah,
we'll write them, but you really um trusting and relying on the people within your whoever's publishing you to give it the best shot. And then book bloggers who are incredible at
yeah,
getting the word out and give their time and thought to doing that, and booksellers who are hand selling books. And actually, at that point, it just becomes something collaborative, particularly with the reader, because they're bringing their own experience and their own memories or ideologies to that experience of reading the book. And then it just takes flight and becomes something else. And I really love that.
yeah, yeah. That's the exciting bit. So let's just take a little bit of a step back. So, how did you actually come to writing in the first place? What's your earliest memory of writing?
So, as with, I'm sure lots of people say this to you, I was very swotty at school. I loved reading. Um, I remember writing a poem about an onion of all things when
It's
I
got
was in
layers.
year. It has got, yeah, nice. I see what you did there. I'm gonna steal that. Um, I remember we had to write, and I think I was 9,
Mhm.
and we had to write something. I can't remember why it was onions of all things. But that was sort of the writing prompt, and I wrote this little poem about an onion that underwent this transformation and became piccalilli. And
That's
I
great.
was so proud of it. I was
Yeah.
only little, and then writing for me became something much more academic. I didn't keep a journal, or I wasn't writing poetry in my angsty teenage years.
Hmm.
But writing was a way to excel at school, I suppose, and then I just fell in love with the subject of English at A level and went on to study that at university. Spent my days reading novels and just loving that. And then decided that I wanted to go into journalism, which I did immediately afterwards, writing for newspapers and magazines, and then moved to TV news, which I absolutely love and still do 2 days a week.
Hmm.
I get lots of inspiration from that for my
Yeah.
writing as well. Um, and I have to say, I just didn't see myself writing a novel, I think because I was so in awe of writers who I admire. They've always been my rock stars, really. And I think
Yeah.
I put them on such a pedestal. They were so high for me. I didn't think that that was something that I could do, I guess. It just
Hmm.
seemed like this very impressive and magical thing. And then I discovered the Panacea Society, of which the Rapture sort of fictionalizes, and just thought someone needs to write a novel about this. And I talked to the museum curator, and she said, "Yeah, it's such,
Mm.
And I just kept coming back to that story. My day job is one where I have to get very immersed in a subject within a few hours, learn as much as I can, get a handle on it, find an angle, present that in a hopefully informative and entertaining way.
Hmm.
But it's very headline stuff.
Of
And
course,
then
yeah.
the next day you get up with no idea what you're going to be talking about,
And
and
you're
you
off
do the
again.
same.
Yeah.
But the Panacea Society and the cult, which I'd grown up not many miles from and had no idea that it was on my doorstep and
Hmm.
had existed for almost 100 years, I just kept coming back to it. And then I thought, well, I'll just have a go at writing a book. Um, and so I did. And that's really where it came from. I did no writing classes. I read no books about it. I just
How did it
started.
feel when you start? Do you remember when you actually started writing it? How did that feel?
I think I tricked myself into it by thinking, well, this is just me, d- you know, this is just me having a go at
Exploring the
writing a book
subject
and
almost.
exploring.
Yeah.
Um, but then I got very much into the planning of it and the research, and I was fortunate enough to be given access to the archives at the Panacea Museum, which essentially was sort of boxes of sealed envelopes, which, they brought them down with a letter opener and said, there you go. And they'd never been
Wow.
opened before.
Wow.
So I was reading things that had been sealed up, sealed confessions sent
Mm,
into the daughter of God,
that's incredible.
sort of well, 100 years before. And it
Yeah.
was just addictive. It was just everyone had a story in it. And I thought, this is so much fun.
Yeah.
Um,
So wonder you ever got round to writing the novel.
I know. I had to allow myself little trips there as a treat. That was
Yeah.
sort of that was the carrot, that was the incentive to get writing. But I think I tricked myself into not realizing what an enormous undertaking it is to write a novel.
Uh-huh.
Um, and fortunately for me, I hadn't looked into the tiny odds of ever getting published, or
Yeah.
the sort of finding an agent, submission to a publisher. I think if I'd read all that, I might have been frightened off it a bit because it's hard and
Yeah.
quite frightening if you think of it in terms of odds.
And
Um,
so when you got to that bit, tell us about that bit. What was your path to publication?
I'm always a bit embarrassed talking about this because I feel like there is a um, maybe not an expectation, but there is a sort of common thread, I think, when people are sharing their stories where it tends to be a story of a steely determination and persistence
Not
and,
always. You'd be
you know,
surprised. Yeah.
well,
I've heard both ends of the spectrum
right,
on this
okay, well, I feel a
podcast,
bit
so
better.
don't worry. Yeah.
Um, I went to the Festival of Writing in New York when I'd written about a quarter of the novel, really to see if anyone else would be as excited about the idea as I was.
Hmm.
And I was chosen to read on the Friday night. I don't know if you've heard it, but they have a sort of they pick I think there's a couple of hundred writers that go and they pick half a dozen to read.
Brilliant.
And I was picked to read in front of all these people. I was
Mhm.
terrified, although I
Yeah.
do TV news for a job, but it
Yeah.
felt much more
Yeah. Personal.
the stakes felt higher. And the people around me who'd been before were saying, this is quite a big deal, agents are going to be listening to this. Sort of started to feel even
Yeah.
more nervous.
Yeah.
And I got quite a lot of interest on that evening. And they were saying, can we read the rest? Well, I hadn't written the rest yet.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I went away and I kept in touch with one of them, Laura Williams at Green and Heaton, who is my agent.
Hmm.
And she'd said, you can send whenever you like. So I kept in touch with her and she gave me some pointers. And then when it came to sending off, I sent to 7 agents and I got offers from 5, which was incredible.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
And then had a wonderful day meeting up with them, and decided to go with Laura because she had loved the idea from the beginning and it had given her time
Yeah. It's kind of
to
shown
me
faith in you.
without any. I mean, there were no promises made on either side, but
Hmm.
I just felt that she would be someone that I would. I think it's a bit like a marriage, finding an agent. They are the person who's going to be with you with the worst of news and the best of news.
Hmm.
And I think when you see their name flash up on your phone, it should be a positive and feel like a safe experience,
Yeah.
whatever the news is. And I just felt that she would have the time to hold my hand a little bit because I had no clue about publishing really.
Hmm.
And that turned out to be a great decision. So she submitted, and we went with a preempt from Faber, which was very, very exciting. I phoned into work that night. I was due to be working the next morning and said,
Hmm.
"Can I take the day off tomorrow?" And I dashed down to London because we had to decide before lunchtime
Yeah.
that day. And Louisa, my editor, made herself free that morning. I made myself free, dashed down and met them. And I probably was supposed to be playing it cool, but I just sort of flung my arms around her and gave her a big hug at the end of the meeting. So
Yeah, that's
no poker face
understandable. No,
whatsoever.
that's great. Yeah, no, that's nice though. I think it's great that it obviously meant so much to you. I think it's brilliant that you kind of got caught up in it.
Yeah, I was listening to, it's not at all a glamorous or sort of intellectual story, but that evening I was cooking dinner, about to take my daughter off to Brownies, I think it was. And I had the realization that they'd never heard of S Club 7. And so we were dancing around the kitchen to Reach for the
Reach for the
Stars.
stars. It had to be. Yeah,
And then I got the call. So that song now, not only was it a guilty pleasure before, but it's now the sort of,
it's
whenever
your
I hear
anthem.
it, it is my anthem. I talked about it in my book launch. the lofty heights
Yeah.
of Faber and all the poets that they can boast. And I quoted in a very deadpan way some S Club 7, as if it was poetry, but it seemed to go down. Everyone loves a bit of S Club 7.
Oh yeah, there's even people that say they don't, they do. You
Exactly.
can't deny that tune. It's a
It,
banger in the
it's
modern
it
parlance.
is banger. Exactly.
So how do you think your journalism side of things, how do you think that kind of feeds into your work, or does it? Does it help you or hinder you? Like particularly because you're kind of doing obviously you're fictionalizing, sort of, you're taking a real life event or a real life character or whatever, and then you're kind of going off that. Does that hinder you anyway? Do you sometimes feel like, oh no, I'm kind of changed that too much, or I've gone a bit too far away from what you know is the fact because you've done the research?
I've had this conversation quite a lot of times because I teach creative writing at Cambridge now, and people will get very worried about, what can I change and
Hmm.
what can't I? And I think for me, I think we all find our own boundaries in which we want to write. And for me, I think it has to be everything in the book, particularly when I was writing The Rapture, was either based on something I had read or inspired by how I felt about something that I'd read. So for me, it was really important tonally to give a sense of this group of women,
Hmm.
and how complex that was, because they had just been sort of ridiculed before as a sort of throwaway, as mad eccentric women.
Hmm.
um and so I do think sometimes, certainly for me, it's more important to be true to my feelings about something, not to sort of dramatize or exaggerate for the sake of dramatic effect. I would never, for instance, have written a murder mystery that happened to be based in a religious cult and use it as a sort of backdrop. It has to
Sure, sure.
grow from the truth for me. But if I'm moving dates around, I mean, I have done that. I'll condense. There was a lot of women in this cult over the years, and I've condensed their stories into a small number of characters, one of
Hmm.
whom is the central characters, one of whom is real, and one of whom is made up, because I needed to have someone join this group from the outside with a fresh pair of eyes,
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
wanted her to be from a different social class at that time. So I think it has to grow from the truth for me, and as much as possible, I personally get kicks from putting in as much of the real thing as I can. So in the Misadventures of Margaret Finch, when I've got Margaret, um, in a pub with a stopwatch making notes on what people are getting up to,
hmm,
why not put in, draw very largely from the real thing, because
yeah,
that's just good fun, and it makes it, for me, it makes it more exciting. And if I have to, you know, the whole point is that these two stories are colliding.
yeah,
Um, so that is already a massive leap of sort of imagination. But I think, sorry to go back to your original question, I think being a journalist is both a help and a hindrance. I think you have to give yourself permission to, you have to sort of unlearn the golden rules.
hmm,
And they are rules in journalism. But I also think that journalists are good at finding an angle
yeah,
and being quite decisive, because in my day job I'll have just a few hours.
yeah,
And I think we're also better at leaving things out. I always think that people only watch on TV or read in a novel what you've decided to put in. And you
that's
might
right.
have all this other research that you personally find really interesting.
Hmm.
Um, but it can just weigh everything down and slow everything up. And I think they're not going to be reading thinking, well, you left out that bit about
No, that's
that
right.
thing. You're really, as I said about publishers, you're kind of curating this story. You're finding an angle, you're finding a way into what is a fascinating little chapter of English history, um, and hopefully making it, as you would attempt to do as a journalist, engaging as well as informative, hopefully entertaining, something that just can cut through and just engage people. So we're also really good at deadlines. I'm told by publishers, journalists will always hit a deadline.
I was going to suggest that, yeah, because in your game, it's non-negotiable.
No, exactly. So I think we're good at that. But I did speak to someone, I can't remember which newspaper it was from, and she said something which I took as a real compliment, which was that when she read The Rapture, she didn't think it'd been written by a journalist. Because I
Right,
think
yeah.
what she was saying was that things can be a bit, I don't know if she was talking about the formality, but I think this need to put everything in and to be
Yeah.
um we have to be really pedantic and real sticklers for
Plus,
things.
there's a style. I think it's fair to say there's a style to
Yeah,
journalism. I know everybody to a certain extent, depending on what it is and what kind of journalism it is, and if it's newspaper journalism, obviously depends on the newspaper and the hairstyle and everything. But even so, I think there's a certain style, a certain way that a news piece is structured. In terms of the way you've got the headline, then you've probably got
yeah,
a log line underneath it, and then you've kind of got the salient things at the top, and then you summarize at the end. There'll be certain things like that, and obviously that's not going to work if you're writing a novel, that sort of style. And obviously you've got to find your own voice and the way that you like to write. And I'm guessing a lot of it is based on over the many years that you've been reading. A lot of that, all that stuff feeds into it as well. And obviously you're somebody that reads a lot of fiction.
yeah, you're right, because if you're writing for a newspaper, a sub editor will just cut from the bottom. So when
Mm,
you're writing for a newspaper to put all your good stuff in the top because
yeah,
there's some sort of statistic that people don't read past whichever
yeah,
paragraph.
yeah,
Um, the rest is just for people who really want the detail. But
that's
in
right.
TV news where I work, it's very much um, I'm going to do that again because I knocked my microphone, sorry.
That's all right.
Um, in TV news, it's very much a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah,
And your big beats are right at the top of the first line and what we call the payoff line at the end. Um, and what I love about TV news is that my role is just to help someone else tell their story. So if I'm interviewing someone and it's usually at the very best moment of their life or the very worst that they're
yeah,
talking about, that's why they're on TV, on the news. Um, I'll interview them and then I will always pick all the bits of them telling their story. And then anything I write is just sort of sewing
linking
those
it
bits
almost.
together.
That's right. Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's their story. And I'm just,
It's similar to what I do. I wouldn't call me, I'm not a journalist, but part of what I do is I do documentaries, short documentaries, and made a feature length documentary. And it's very similar. It's
yeah,
especially the idea of, obviously, I've conducted the interviews over, depending on how long the project is or whatever, could be over hours or days or whatever, many people. And, sometimes I have to remind myself if because I'm editing it as well, I'll be thinking, oh, that's a really, really great comment.
yeah.
It's such a shame that's not. And then I'm like, but nobody knows about it except
No,
you and the person
exactly.
that was on the shoot. And if it doesn't serve the rest of the story that you're telling, or the angle, as you say, that you've chosen, whatever it is, the point that you're trying to hammer home and the thing that you're trying to get across, then it's irrelevant, and you don't include it. And obviously, after a period of time as well, you forget about it anyway.
Yeah,
I've watched some of my things that I've edited in the past, and I'll watch them, and I'm sure if I went back to the rushes and I looked at the original footage, I'd be like, oh yeah, I had that really great comment about that. I wonder why I didn't put that in. Well, you didn't
yeah.
put it in because it didn't serve whatever you were trying to say at the time. So
Well,
I
more likely
totally
you didn't
relate
have
to
the
that.
time
Yeah, that's yeah,
in
exactly,
the what the producer had given you. But I think
exactly,
it's
yeah.
probably I think it's the same in documentaries as it would be in a say a 2.5 minute news
Mm,
package. And I think it's the same for novels. So when I write, this probably really annoys my colleagues, but if you've edited a piece, um, that every it's kind of a conversation for me between what
mm.
the interviewee will say, and then I'll sort of riff on what they've said and lead on to their next point.
Yeah, that's it.
And a really good piece, you shouldn't be able to lift any of that out. So
No.
when a producer is suddenly short of time, because of some other breaking news stories happen, they're looking to lose 20, 30 seconds out of your piece.
Mm.
And if it's a really good piece, like they can't do that because it's like in a novel. If you took a section out,
Yeah, it falls
it,
apart.
it falls apart. And I think if you've written a novel or you're writing one and you could lift a whole chapter or section out and the rest would still make sense, that's a good time to question whether that should be in there.
Absolutely,
Um,
yeah.
or is it just in there for the reasons that you've said, that you personally know it's a good bit.
Yeah. And I think the thing with the novel, sometimes I've had it when I've been editing before where, I thought, well, this is good writing in inverted commas. This bit's I love what I've done here, but like you've just said, it's like, yeah, but it's not actually doing anything for the story. And sometimes I think, right, well, is there a way that I can rewrite this, or I can somehow include it in the novel to do what I need it to do, but still take the bits that I like about it and still put them in, somewhere. You could do that. Obviously, you don't often have that luxury when you're doing an edit. And it's the same because I did make like I do corporate stuff and branded content and all that stuff as well. And often it is like, well, you've got 2 minutes.
Yep.
And so, with the best will in the world. And yourself when you're on it, you're probably the same when you're on a shoot and you're doing a news piece and someone's throwing loads and loads and loads of stuff at you, or well, you've not asked me about this, or you've not asked me
Yeah.
about that. And you're like, well, sometimes you do it just for political reason while you're in the room to keep them happy, but you think, I'm never going to use this. I know I've got the story in my head now. I know what it is. I know what this piece is, and that doesn't fit into it. But okay,
Yeah.
I'll ask you. Yeah,
Well, yeah, especially if it is the worst time in their life and they might be talking about the
of
recent death of
course.
someone,
Yeah,
I
God.
would
Yeah,
just, if they want to talk for an hour and a
yeah,
half,
yeah,
they will talk and we'll stay and record.
yeah,
And that's,
yeah,
that's, I think the problem, but also the privilege is that you're part of that story. And if it's something awful that's happened, you can't make it any better for them, but you can be
no,
really determined not to make that experience any worse. Because
absolutely. Yeah,
um that's something, that more often than not they've contacted us because they want to raise awareness of something or raising money or um and I think and also if it's a really good thing that's happened, you're inextricably linked to that moment, that sort of chapter of their lives.
mm,
And I'm aware that I see a different person every day, but that could be what it would be a really big thing to be talking about something so personal. So I think people just need the time to tell their story. And I always say to people, when you watch it later, this is going to feel inadequate because it is, because we're
yeah,
talking about your loved one and it's three
yeah,
minutes,
yeah. Sure.
but we're just trying to get a message across.
Yeah.
Um, when it
Do
comes
you?
to not, sorry, go on.
Sorry. Go
Sorry.
no. Go on.
Just what you were saying about, these bits where we think that's great writing. And when I'm teaching creative writing, there's a lot of discussion about voice, and what the hell voice is, which seems to be something that there isn't a definitive answer to.
Yeah.
But I always think of, or I always talk to students about how, we're in a kind of contract with the reader. They know that we are manipulating them. They know that we're making stuff up. They know that we're going to be tugging at all sorts of emotional responses in them, but they kind of, you know, put on the seatbelt in the roller coaster and they're there for the ride. And
Hmm.
they know that this is to some degree artifice, although one would hope that they would feel truth in what we're writing.
Uh-huh.
But what they don't want to do, what I don't want as a reader is to be reminded that I'm being manipulated because I want to be immersed in it.
Yeah.
And I think it's those places where the authorial voice whispers too insistently and sort of talks over the characters
Yeah.
that I think it
Absolutely.
fails. And you can see that I think it happens particularly when we're trying to be clever because
Yeah. That's
kind
exactly
of
right. Author
talk
intrusion,
over
isn't
it.
it? Yeah.
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 And that's the point where I'm reminded that this is just a block of paper with words on it and that I really should be doing my tax return or the ironing or something. And that's when
Yeah.
I would put it down.
Yeah.
And so I think voice for me is making sure that we are, as I said about news package, really sort of facilitating the characters to tell their story and helping with those. I think it's a bit like the difference between an osteopath or a chiropractor. We don't want any clunky crunches where something pops. You want the sort
Yeah.
of laying on of hands of this sort of gentle, um, just maneuvering things to get the right kind of alignment for everything to flow. And but for that to be invisible when we're reading the result of it.
Absolutely. And it's the same with going back to editing. Uh, video editing, for example, there's always a thing where is if somebody says, "Oh, that's really good editing," then I'm like, ugh, because you shouldn't be able to see when
Yeah,
editing's really good, you shouldn't notice it. And I think it's exactly
exactly.
the same with writing. It's like if you could suddenly say, "Oh my God, that is amazing writing," for the wrong reasons. Obviously, writing is great if it moves you and it's emotive and all that kind of stuff. But if somebody starts saying, every other line, "Well, that's just great writing," but oh, by the way, I don't care about the characters, then there's something wrong, isn't there?
Yeah. It's like punctuation as well. It's there to, it should hopefully disappear, and it's a way of helping us as readers navigate this world that we're in. But it's like like road signs, we shouldn't really notice them.
Well, there's that whole debate that I see come up like every other week on Twitter or whatever about speech tags.
Yeah,
And my view on it is I kind of agree that it's in 99.9% of the time it should be said, say or say it
yeah,
says or said
yeah,
or whatever, because it is one of those invisible things. I mean, a lot of the time I try to get away without using them at all wherever I can, if it's just two people in a scene and I can just go back and forth and then just put a little bit of action
exactly.
in,
Yeah, exactly.
because as a reader you do it anyway without realizing. I think when you read it, you just basically skip to the next set of speech marks and you could read the next bit of dialogue. And once you're in it and you know who's speaking, you're kind of off with it. And as soon as you start getting, gasped or, uh, he said, his voice trembling,
Yes.
and all those sorts of things.
I'm going to sound like a sort of a real oldie here, but I do worry a bit about, and I think fiction, will always be great. I don't agree that the death of the novel's coming, and that the death of books because we've gone on to Kindle and all these things. We
Hmm.
still love books and we still love to
Yeah,
read. But the way that creative writing is taught in school now, and the things that my children are expected to do, it's like taking someone out for their first driving lesson, and instead of letting them put their feet on the pedals or their hands on the steering wheel, giving them a diagram of how an internal
yeah,
combustion engine
yeah,
works.
yeah.
It's this kind of, you've got to have wow words in everything, and you've got
Mm,
to, every sentence must have this, and they can pick apart in a way that I can't because I wasn't taught it,
hmm.
all the different sort of building blocks
Yeah,
grammatically of a sentence
yeah,
and what they're all
yeah,
called and which
yeah.
bit's
I'm
this and
the
which bit's
same. I
that.
can't do that. Yeah.
Um, but it's so artificial, because it's just about, you're going to get a tick if you've done this and you're going to get a tick if you've done that, and the more sort of flowery and the bigger the words you use, and
I
if
think
you
it's been happening for some time. I think it's the bit that's missing from creative writing is creative. I mean, I
yeah,
noticed I I I absolutely loved writing. As soon as I could write, I loved writing. I just loved writing stories and whatever. I just got into it. I loved it at primary school, and then I was really lucky when I was at high school. I had an English teacher that also really liked creative writing, and he set a lot of creative writing things, and we had a lot of things where we could literally just write a story. It might have been based on a prompt or
yeah,
write it in the style of this book or whatever, but it was creative writing. And then when I got to the next school when I was 14, I think in the whole time from being 14 to finishing my A levels, I think I did sort of two pieces of creative writing in 4 years. And that was a long time ago, but I just get the impression that that's gone even further that way. I mean, I don't, I've got a daughter that's, she's 21 now, but I don't remember her doing lots and lots of creative writing when she was great. What I would class as creative writing, i.e., go and write a story, say, for example, or a poem even. Again, it was like do it in this very specific style and make sure you've got this number of rhymes in it, or you've
yeah,
got to do it about, like you said, really, really prescriptive. And to me, the best thing about it was having somebody saying, and you can literally write about anything you like. And I think, depending on what kind of person you are, I mean, obviously, if you're not wired like that, obviously that is absolutely terrifying. I know people that if you said that to them, they'd be like, oh my God, I've got to make up something from nothing. But for people that actually like writing and like creative writing, that's like the most exciting thing. It's like I
yeah.
can literally do anything. I can literally write about anything. That's amazing.
Which is really difficult if you're indecisive, because,
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
and I think that's why I go back to, I mean, both the novels, and actually the third I'm working on, which is all top secret as it stands, but they've all come from things that I've stumbled across while I've been out reporting,
Yeah.
as a TV journalist. And I think I think we all need. It's like drops of rain need a particle, don't they, to be able for the water to condense around it. There has to be a little
Mm,
tiny piece of grit there. And
yeah.
I think for me, I find a grain of something, and for other writers, and I think probably for me in future, that could be an overheard conversation on a train, or it could be, an image of something that you see when you're watching a film. It doesn't matter how small it is, but then it kind of grows out like a snowflake, doesn't it?
Hmm.
And yeah, working out the things that trouble us as well. I think fiction is a great place to do that. And you realize, I don't know if you find this, but you can write something and then you think it's about A, and then you get to the end of it and think, oh, I've written a
Absolutely,
book
yeah.
about this.
Especially, yeah, with a book. I don't think you ever, even whether you're a planner or whether you're a pantser or whatever, I don't think you ever really know what your book's about until it's finished. And then it's when you go back. When I say finished, you've finished a draft of it, and you go back and you're, oh, yeah, I thought it was about this. It's actually about this. And obviously, that's when you start editing, you can say, right, okay, well, I really want to mine that now. This is obviously what I've chosen to write about without realizing.
And the best feeling is when someone comes up to you that's read your work and says, I love the way you did this. It was so clever that you
Yeah,
did that.
they've
And you
spotted
think,
it.
no, but you did had no, you just nod and go, oh, great. And you think,
Yeah, did I
that was
do that?
completely accidental, but I'll take the credit. People think I'm much cleverer than I really
That's
am,
it. Yeah,
um,
yeah.
but they show you things in your work that have sort of been brought to life by their perspective. And
That's
then when
what's
you look at
great.
it,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
think, oh, that is in there, but I
That's
didn't
what's
see
great
it
about art.
myself.
That's right. That's what's great about art anyway, isn't it? As you say, everybody, you're as a writer, you're bringing all that stuff or your life experience and everything else to the story, but then somebody else interacts with it and they're bringing all their baggage and all the rest of their life experience and everything else, and they see it in a totally different way. And obviously, that can be good and bad. But that's what's so exciting about it, I think.
Yeah, and it depends so much on their personality. With the Rapture, I wrote an ending that was completely ambiguous. That in the draft that I first sent
Yeah,
to my agent, it could have it was so ambiguous that the advice I was given was that you need to just tilt the scales one way slightly more than the other.
yeah.
So I
Give
added
us something.
two tiny
Hmm.
details of the place that the person is in at the end. Um, and before I made those small changes, I showed the I shared the book with some friends, most of them writers, and it was fascinating to me that around 50% said, "I'm so glad that she was here at the end. I'm so glad this," and I just
Yeah.
was so moved by it. And the other half said, "I can't believe you did this to her at the end." And when I said to them, "Oh, did you not think it was the opposite?" They absolutely
Yeah.
they were so I just think we bring our own the people who
Totally.
want a
Yeah.
happy ending are desperate to find a happy ending. And the
That's
people
it.
who
Yeah.
don't want that neat ending will find that. And it was fascinating to me that the same words, they could be absolutely
It's
convinced.
amazing. Yeah. That's what's so great about it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a pretty good place to kind of wrap things up. But before we do, why don't you just remind people, obviously, when the book is out? By the time this podcast goes live, the book will be out anyway. But just remind them that, and also tell them where they can find out more about you online.
So The Misadventures of Margaret Finch is published by Faber, hardback on the 6th of April, paperback to follow. And you can find me online. I'm just venturing back onto Twitter after taking a bit of a break. So at Claire McGlasson on Twitter and at Claire McGlasson on Instagram, which I'm finding I'm warming to lately. I was always a Twitter girl, but I'm warming to Instagram. So yeah, I'd love people to get in touch.
I will, and I'll put all those links in the show notes at joinedupwriting.co.uk. But for now, Claire, thanks a million for coming on Joined Up Writing.
Thanks so much. I've loved our chat. Thank you.
Joined up writing.
There you go. Thanks again to Claire, and I'll put all of the links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, other than me reminding you to make sure that you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts from, and that way you can have the podcast downloaded automatically every week. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts, because it does help other people find the show, or, just tell one of your mates. So that's it for this week, but thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.